the nature of the movement itself that was fighting in South Sudan and to the relationship that was built with the United States. So I preview this in the book. I think the ethos of the movement that Dr. John Garang built was deeply undemocratic, and this was something that was largely unseen to foreigners and to supporters both in the United States and elsewhere in Europe and in the region. I think it lacked a meaningful connection with average South Sudanese people. This became an elite class of political leaders in South Sudan that over time become increasingly accountable not to their people, but to a constituency of foreigners too willing to back them at any price. And I think lastly, there's this party factionalism. So as we know, when Dr. John Garang, in some ways one of the fathers of South Sudan, dies tragically in a helicopter crash at this really existential moment for South Sudan, there's little that's left in his wake. And these elite factions within his party fight for control, right? And so there's a vacuum, and rather than having all these guys developing a new platform and new ideas and a new political program for the future of South Sudan, instead they're engaged in a really vicious behind-the-scenes battle for control of the party.
Your book captured the situation after the death of Garang very, very, very well, and you mentioned that deficit in leadership when Garang died.
What year was that again he died?
He died in 2005, July to be precise, at the end of July. Now, when you started chapter 12 with a very interesting quote that we made Italy, now we need to make Italians. And you went on to argue that South Sudanese got independence, but they failed to get the nation. Talk in that effect a little bit.
Sure. I think very often in this day and age, whether in South Sudan or other places around the world, we focus on the question of state building. And that's critically important, building the mechanisms and the institutions of a functioning state. But we focus too little, I think, on building a nation. So the sort of glue that had held South Sudanese constituencies together during their long struggle was a collective opposition to the North, was a collective opposition to repressive governments in the capital in the North, in Khartoum, and that kept the people together behind this common goal. But once that was achieved, really the bottom fell out, and the cracks that had long existed within South Sudanese society are then exposed. And as I said, rather than develop a new plan, a new political program, new ideas about what would bind South Sudanese together, these political elites sadly engage in a power struggle that really rips the social fabric of South Sudanese society, which was so delicate and was just beginning to heal.
You talk about these elites so much in your book. Garang was a leader of what is now the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. And most of the people who are leading this country today, the South Sudan, are people who are with Garang. What went wrong? Why did Garang's ideology not continue in what is now South Sudan?
I think in part this is due to the ethos of the movement. So perhaps over-learning the lessons of liberation movements past, Dr. John Garang was very worried about the cracks emerging within South Sudanese society. And so his answer was to grip that movement very tightly. And so all of the leadership decisions, all of the direction of the movement wasn't happening by committee. It wasn't happening through building up democratic structures. It really was happening through him and him alone. And so as some White House officials at the time comment during the Bush administration, when he dies, there's nothing left. And the United States in particular didn't have relationships with others that could carry that cause forward.
And just the current relationship, or rather the relationship between the South Sudan government and the United States, has been shaky right from the time of former President Barack Obama to this current administration. Why did the U.S. fail out with the government in Juba?
A good portion of this book tries to take a deep look at the role of the United States. It's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is I don't think we're particularly good at lessons learned. I think we're particularly bad when it comes to Africa. We don't take it as seriously as some other regions of the world, and yet as we look about our own posture and our own relationships in Yemen or in Syria or in Afghanistan or the next crisis, I do think there are some lessons learned that we should be examining more closely in South Sudan. So there's an epigraph that opens chapter 22 of the book, which is called Love Lost. And this is really, as you allude, about the relationship between the United States and South Sudan, which sours over time. And I sat down with one of America's foremost champions of the SPLM and asked him about this. And he said, you know, you can become very close to someone, but still be a tough friend. And we were never a tough friend. And for me, that kind of sums up the relationship. So it's it's really important to note that there wouldn't be a South Sudan today if it weren't for the United States. And the role of the U.S. was critical throughout, providing food aid during the South's long liberation struggle, helping to end a war in 2005 that the South Sudanese couldn't end on their own, and ultimately guaranteeing that right to self-determination. But having adopted the underdog's cause and leaned on the scales and, in my opinion, moved on too soon, I think the role of the West warrants critical reflections. So